So I think one of the best ways to learn a language is to do it with someone else, pair programming. And I want to sort of give a little bit of a plug, if you haven't tried it before, why you should try it. And pair programming is actually a thing. There's a process for doing it. It doesn't just mean that there are two people working. So, is there a more social way to do programming than the stereotype of somebody who's by themselves, they stay up all night, they caffeinate a lot? What would be the benefits of having multiple people doing this together? And in particular, how do you prevent the situation where one person is sort of doing all of the work and the other person is sort of half distracted or not really have their mind in the game? So the reason to do this is that, in principle, if two people are sort of cross-checking each other on task, it might improve the quality of the software. It might reduce the time to completion, because places where one person has a hesitation in what they know, the other person might be able to fill in. A lot of companies either mandate doing this or strongly endorse it. And I would recommend that you give it an honest try and see if you like it. Some students have tried this and they sort of never go back to solo programming. Some find that it doesn't help them so much. So we're not going to mandate that you do it, but really recommend give it a try if at all possible. These photos were taken a few years ago at Pivotal Labs, which really I think of as one of the places that really practices the Agile extreme programming methodology very rigorously. And a thing to notice, first of all, is that these two programmers are pairing right now. They're not using their own computer. There's a bunch of pair programming sort of workstations, and they're all set up the same, and you just pick one. So if there's no, if it's not your computer, it's much harder to get distracted because your apps aren't on it. You don't check email except at lunch. When you take a coffee break or a lunch break, you get your laptop and then you can do sort of your things. But the rest of the time, you're working with your pair programming partner. And when you're working on pair programming, there's one person who's the driver, one person is the observer. The driver is typing stuff, and the driver is basically thinking out loud as they type, and they're essentially explaining as they go, well, let's see, we need to grab this data structure, and I think I need to check whether any of the elements are nil. And so as they're sort of typing and thinking out loud, the observer is cross-checking what they're doing. The observer is also sort of strategically thinking about, okay, well, once that part of the code is typed or once that function is finished, what's the thing we have to work on next? So you've got one person who's sort of thinking a little bit, a couple of steps ahead while they're cross-checking what the first person's doing. And then you've got a person who's actually typing code and sort of explaining out loud as they're typing, almost like a live coding demo. And every 10 to 15 minutes, they switch. So new employees who go to Pivotal, and this is kind of the first time that they're doing this is how all programming is done there. And they report that if you do this for an 8-hour workday, it's really exhausting. And by the way, one of the reasons is since you can't be distracted, there's nothing to distract you, you really are spending all of your time programming, right? Sometimes you feel like, oh, wow, I just spent 4 hours coding. But if you break down the time, you probably spent an hour and a half doing other little distracting things. So I guess the question is, does pair programming actually end up helping with software quality? What the studies have found is that for simple tasks, it is in fact quicker because you sort of have fewer roadblocks. For more complicated tasks, it isn't quicker, but you get better code out of it. And anecdotally, sometimes the code is more readable because you've got another person sort of cross-checking. And that's an immediate opportunity for them to say, well, wouldn't it be simpler or wouldn't it be more clear if you did it this other way? So it's sort of like having a programming assistant always around. It is more effort because now you're sort of spending two programmers' time where you would have had one before. But the argument is that for getting smaller things done quicker and getting complex things done at higher quality, it's worth the trade-off. And it does keep both programmers focused, right? When you're working with someone else and they're expecting you to take an active role, whether you're the driver or the observer, it's not okay for you to sort of drift off and check email or something and let the other person continue to work. So it also brings a kind of self-discipline. And importantly, the two programmers learn from each other, not just specific things about the code that they're writing, but tips about how to use the tools or, inside information that helps you do better in that company or in that group. Latest technologies, libraries that you didn't know about. They said, oh, if we want to solve that problem, I actually know a package that will do that. We don't have to write that code manually. And some teams embrace this so much that they arrange it so that, for example, on different days, you pair with different people on the team, and eventually everybody on the team has paired with everybody else. And believe it or not, that is actually called promiscuous pairing. And no, that is not a way to solve the shortage of programmers problem, but I think it's kind of a fun term. So if you're going to try this, and we highly recommend you do, If you're the observer, meaning you're not the person actually typing on the one keyboard, don't get distracted. Focus on the task at hand. Pair with someone who is either more or less experienced than you. Both of you will benefit. If you have more experience, you will benefit from explaining as you go. If you have less experience, you'll benefit from working with someone who's got a little more facility with the language and doesn't sort of have to look things up quite as often. And really important, change roles frequently. Like set a timer, every 10 minutes, change roles, because the roles exercise different skills. If you're the observer, the skill is thinking ahead just a little bit and sort of cross-checking somebody's code. And obviously, if you're the driver, it's thinking on your feet and turning your thoughts into code as you go. Michael and I have taught this class many times. I've also taught it with Turing Award winner Dave Patterson. And every time we teach it, we sort of do a survey at the end of the most useful tips that the students in the class would give to future students. So periodically, you'll see a slide that has this top 10 icon, which means we've gathered the top 10 most popular pieces of advice. This one was number 6 out of 10. And students said things like pair programming avoided silly mistakes that otherwise might have taken a long time to debug, and changing partners frequently in a group project made the team more cohesive. Everybody had a sense of what everybody else was doing and what people's strengths and weaknesses were in terms of their skills. So we hope you'll give pair programming a try, especially if you haven't spent much time with Ruby or Rails. And if you can find somebody who has, pairing is a great way to get up to speed a lot faster.